So, okay, third question. And I think this is what we'd all want to know. The
Yeah.
story on how you met Brené Brown and ended up in her
Uh,
book.
yeah, I know. I'm still shocked. Like I had to re-listen to it. I was listening to it again a couple months ago to prepare for some work I was doing. And I was just listening to it while I was like running around the house. And it got to the section in the book that I'm in. And sometimes it doesn't even feel like that's me. So how I ended up meeting Brené, so I, been a big fan of her work since about 2010, had taken group command in 2016, was using not the Dare to Lead program, but another program she had at the time called Daring Leaders, was using that program as a leadership development tool with my 6 squadron commanders. And we would sit down once a month and go through the videos that were provided, and it had worksheets with like discussion questions. And so we would talk through the questions, and we did that once a month for 2 hours. And like, that was our leadership development team building activity, so that we could have the kind of conversations that we've been talking about, right? Like these conversations that really allow us to kind of go deep and understand like what's driving us to show up as the leaders we're showing up as. A lot of people out there knew I was a big Brené fan. A PA officer that I've known for years, Lieutenant Colonel Becky Heisey, was out at Luke Air Force Base, and she sends me a note one day and says, "You're never going to believe who's coming to Luke. Brené is coming to Luke." And I was like, "What? I'm her number 1 fan. Like, doesn't she know that? Like, I've got the big styrofoam number. Like, if she's going number 1 fan." And I'm like, if she's going anywhere, why isn't she coming here? Like, how did she end up at Luke? So
Everyone goes to Luke.
I know. Well,
everyone.
This just goes to show you, like, take a chance, right? The wing exec, like, just cold called, emailed her and was like, "Hey, we want you to come to Luke." And she happened to be doing an event in Arizona at the same time and was like, "Yeah, I'll come to Luke." So Becky calls me and says she's coming to Luke. I happen to know the wing commander. I called the wing commander and I said, "We've been using her program for 2 years. It would be a great culmination of our time together to be able to come out and see her in person." And he said, "Yeah, come on out, bring your commanders out." So I went and talked to my wing commander and said, "I'd love to take my commanders." Keep in mind, like, I'm taking the entire MSG leadership, right? We're going off the base. So we flew out to Luke, attended her in-person program. And during one of the breaks, I went up to, side note, give her like this little gift I made her because I'm that cheesy. And so I went up to present this thing I made her and shared with her the story about the card, right? I told her, like, "I just want to thank you. And if I can share with you what this means to me." And I did. And of course, I was tearing up and she was tearing up, and my commanders are looking at me like Colonel Halfhill has lost her marbles. And then
wow, you just let it, you saw that was your moment to really let her know how you felt, and you just went after it. I appreciate that. That's a boss move.
Or crazy. Like, can someone call security?
No, I would do the exact same thing.
Oh,
so I'm right there with you.
So I just said, if you ever want to know, and my commander started sharing with her what the conversations meant to them. I tell people all the time, like, the Dare to Lead program is amazing. It's not the end all be all. Brené Brown is unbelievably insightful, incredible, but also there's a ton of other people out there we also can learn from. But the material allowed us to have conversations that are life-changing. And they shared with her the conversations, how they affected their parenting and their marriages, and most certainly the way they engage their airmen. And I just said to her, if you ever want to know some stories about what that looked like for us, please give me a call. And she did. And so I shared with her a couple stories that I, by grace of luck, had shared regularly. So they were packaged nicely. And, she took the loneliness story, which was really, I'm so grateful. the other story, one of the other stories I tell a lot is about race and how hard it is to have the discussion on race. But you asked me earlier, like, what was one of my proudest moments in the Air Force? It wasn't that I was in the book, but it was that story was in the book. And the number of people who have reached out to me since then to just say, thank you, because I could see myself in that story and I got help, or I could see myself in that story and I reached out to someone. I could see the leader I wanted to be in that story by really leaning into the hard moments. And so that story isn't about me. I mean, actually, if you read the story, it kind of highlights like how terrified I was and how inept and unprepared I probably was for that conversation. But the fact that the conversation is getting kind of like front and center out there, so people know that we have to get really clear on emotion, that it wasn't just about being tired, but that people were lonely, and how much, because we don't have that granularity on the emotional experiences we're having, we often communicate them as something like tired. And if we communicate a feeling of loneliness using a language like tired or a word like tired, we lose an opportunity to address a root cause. We lose an opportunity to address the thing we really need to address. So I'm grateful the story's in the book, whether I'm associated with it or not. I'm so grateful the story's out there because I know it has helped people get help.
Yeah, I love that. When people, like, you put something out there, you don't know what to expect, right? You don't know how people are going to react. And then when you get messages like that, it's really special because like it kind of opens your eyes to how many people like have things on their minds or on their hearts that they're just withholding, and you kind of gave them like an insight into your life, and they were able to connect with that.
Yeah.
Why don't you run us through that story that's from the book?
Sure. So it was while I was the MSG, I was out one day talking to a group of our airmen from our comm squadron, and I had been there to present an award. And at the end of the award presentation, I said, who has some questions? And this airman raised his hand and he said, ma'am, when is the ops tempo going to slow down? Because we're tired. And I said, yeah, I hear you. Like, I know we ask a lot of you. And I said, who's tired? The whole squadron raises their hand. There's probably about 40 people out there, that maybe 35, 40 people out there that day. And everybody raises their hand. It was hot. We were sitting there like, yeah, we're tired. Not only that, but the heat's like driving us crazy. And so I said, yeah, I hear you. Like, we ask a lot of you. We've been at war for 20 years. I had just come from Air Mobility Command, where I sat in with the 4-star as wing commander after wing commander, told him the same thing. Like, our airmen are really tired when we're not deployed, or we're not at war, we're not deployed. We have an exercise. When we don't have an exercise, we have training. When we don't have training, we have an inspection. And it's just, sometimes it can feel like it's one thing after the other. And I said, so yeah, I hear you. And I said, but I had just read an article like 3 days prior in the Harvard Business Review, and it was talking about this organization that was going into these 5 companies that were reporting high levels of exhaustion. And it wanted to understand what was going on in these companies that they were reporting such high levels of exhaustion, like what was happening in their ops tempo with their employees, with their procedures. And so it spent months really digging into these companies. And what it found at the end of that time was not that people were tired, but that the employees were lonely. And so I asked them that day, after sharing that story with them, I said, if I were to ask you today, instead of who's tired, who's lonely, how many of you would raise your hands? And to be honest, like, I asked it slightly rhetorically, like I didn't really expect anyone would answer, because I think we both know and can feel like sometimes to say like, I'm lonely, it's not an emotion or a word that we are that's culturally acceptable to always say, right? In some ways, there's a degree of shame associated with that, being lonely. And sometimes when we look at people and we think, oh, you're lonely, we don't really know you're not going to cling to me, are you? You're not going to like suddenly become like, I can't get you, I can't get my own space. And so I think sometimes we ourselves get a little afraid of it. And so I stood there and I said, if I were to ask you, instead of who's tired, who's lonely, how many of you would raise your hands? And about 15 people in the group raised their hands that day. And, I stood there not really knowing what to do, because I thought, I just opened a can of worms that I don't know how to address. Like, I don't know what to do, but at this exact same time, what I did know is that as a commander and as a leader in our Air Force for more than 20 years at that point, I had spent an inordinate amount of time trying to figure out how we address this problem with suicide and how we reach our airmen who are making this ultimate decision. And so I had these two flash thoughts of, I don't know what to do, but I know I have to do something, because if you tell me you're tired, what I'm probably going to do more than likely is to say, go get some rest, take some leave, and I'm going to send you off. But if what's really going on is you're lonely and I send you away because I didn't ask the right question, then I'm potentially exacerbating the very thing we are trying so hard in our Air Force to address. And loneliness is a huge contributing factor to people who decide to take their lives. And so I knew I had to do something, but I also knew like I wasn't equipped. And there was such a part of me that day that wanted to be like, where's the mental health professional so I can bring them in to deal with this? But I also realized in that moment that as leaders, like, we have to get comfortable with this, with the language of emotion that makes us so uncomfortable. Like, we have to, more than anybody, get comfortable with the messiness, with the discomfort, with the uncertainty of the language of the emotions we're feeling. Because I had an opportunity there that day to talk to them and reach an airman at a point when maybe they weren't so far down that path, when I could still get them help before they were so far gone, I'd have less of an opportunity. And so we had a great conversation. But when it really hit me was in that moment, I realized like I need to tell more people this story. And I started telling that story everywhere I could. I went to Wing Stand Up and I told the story. Next time I went out to another squadron, I told the story. When I'm at the headquarters for the MSG conference, I tell the story. When I get an opportunity to go speak to a group, I tell the story. And what I saw in those moments, the first few times I started to share that story, was I would see a person in the back of the room nodding their head as I was telling it, right? Like you could tell they were connecting. I would see people tearing up, which told me in that moment they were experiencing it themselves. And I knew from those moments on, like, I have to tell this story because, like you, with not drinking, we don't talk enough about the truth of our experience and we feel alone. We feel really alone in our loneliness, in our uncertainty, in our grief, in our sadness, in our insecurity. And so yeah, we had a great conversation. And then the second part of that is I had a commander come up to me and she said, ma'am, I talk to my airmen all the time about being disconnected. And I said, disconnected, that feels like such a sterile word. Like if you're an airman and I say, are you feeling a little disconnected? Like, does that feel like I see you? But if I say, are you lonely? Can you just feel it? Like it's a different feeling. It's a humanity. It says, I see the human in you, the human in me understands the human in you. And it's a different way of connecting. And I became really passionate about language and saying, we need to teach leaders the language of emotion so that we can help each other and our airmen and everyone step into that space to acknowledge it and not let it control us, to take back control over the emotions we feel and use them as data so that we can respond versus react.
Wow. I love that you asked that question. Like that's a terrifying thing to ask a group of people. But like what I think is more telling is that people actually raise their hand, like they felt safe enough to acknowledge something that would bring upon shame, that's hard to admit, right? So the fact that, I think the story is so powerful because it just opens your eyes to how such a simple question could connect with someone on such a deep level.
Yeah, here's something that wasn't in the book. And to be honest, I really struggled with sharing for a long time. But the truth is, that story, the article in Harvard Business Review resonated with me for a reason, right? Like I read that article, I read hundreds of articles. Why did that one stick with me? Because I was suffering from that myself, right? Like I was experiencing a degree of loneliness myself. I'm not married. I don't have kids. So for 25 years in the Air Force, I was traveling by myself, new assignments, new communities. As a female in the senior ranks, there were fewer and fewer of us the longer I was in. And so, and I love my male peers, but let's be honest, most of the men aren't going to go home to their wives and be like, hey, hon, we have this great single woman at work we should bring over for dinner. Like that's just not happening. And so I too was feeling really lonely, but here's why that story, I think to some degree saved my life, because there was a couple of days actually, where I drove into my garage and the thought crossed my mind, just leave the car running. Wow. Just leave the car running and you won't have to experience this loneliness anymore. Leave the car running and it won't be so hard. And then, but the thought was fleeting. It scared me enough to go, wow, I need to look at that and I need to think about it. But the truth is, like, I think we all have moments where we go, man, this is hard. And I don't always know if I can keep doing it. But that moment that day probably saved me because it forced me to start talking about it. And the more I talked about it, the more people came up to me and said, I'm lonely too. And I suddenly started to feel less alone, right? Like we've got to be better about sharing the struggles we have as humans because we have them and they have for thousands and thousands of years. You go back and read any of the Stoicism writing, right? It's all the exact same struggles we have today. But for some reason today, we think we have to protect against them and we have to hide them. And it shows that we're weak rather than we're human. So I didn't tell people that when that story was out, but that's the truth of why that moment hit me, why that article hit me, because I was really trying to figure out that space myself.
Holy cow. Yeah. We're all in this together. Right. So, and I think it's kind of amazing that, it makes sense why you had the courage to ask that question in that moment to your team. Mm-hmm. Right. Like you were feeling that yourself. You were going through it yourself. I think it's incredible that you were there for your team in such a vulnerable way.
Thank you.
You know what I mean? And thank you for sharing that too.
I mean, I think I'm lucky because, finding my way into this work where we get to have conversations about, I have conversations almost on a daily basis now about, vulnerability and the shame we can sometimes feel when we think we're not enough or when we think we should play small. I'm in a space every day now where I get to talk to leaders as a coach. I get to talk to leaders about where they struggle. And the truth is, like, what pulled me out was just knowing I wasn't alone. And we can do that for one another without having to be in the exact same space. And it's called empathy. So through a series of events, I was able to experience empathy without having someone, sit down and talking to someone. But over and over and over again, as people came up to me, as I talked to leaders, as I increased my coaching, as I went out and talked to people, I was flooded with stories that told me I wasn't alone. And it was